So the title of my presentation is Developing Adaptive Performers. And the general message that I want to share with this presentation is how we can encourage greater adaptivity among employees, and particularly those employees who are, we might label, more resistant to change or not motivated by change. However, I'll spend some time at the beginning of this presentation just kind of reviewing what adaptive performance is, what behaviors it entails, and also why employees struggle with changes at work, because I think we need this background to understand what's needed to really cultivate these qualities in employees. So let's start with some context. Now, the belief that remaining competitive requires continual adaptation, this has become a mainstay in contemporary management theory and practice. And for every leader that's reading one of these books or one of these articles, there's an employee reading this. So adaptability, how to deal with the change that you did not ask for. And interestingly, if you look up this book on Amazon, you see that customers that purchased this book also purchased 50 Things to Do Before Seeing a Psychiatrist. And you really don't have to look far to understand what might drive employees to seek help, to seek even professional help when dealing with the stress created by change. So changes at work, they can trigger certain job stressors. First and foremost could be performance issues. So I might have been a good performer prior to a change introduced at work, but now suddenly a change has been introduced and doing what I've always done before doesn't get the same results. Or maybe this is related to changes in the way my work effectiveness has been, is evaluated. So it used to be based on a metric that I was really good at, and now it's based on a metric that I struggle with. You could imagine, for example, a customer service employee who used to be rated in terms of customer service ratings from their customers, so how well they served customers, being suddenly rated in terms of how many sales they actually produced, and that they could maybe do better at one or the other. I have from my own experience, actually. I worked in production for many years, or product production for many years, and I know that at one time my work of effectiveness was evaluated in terms of how well I met deadlines, or how well I met my cost of goods objectives. But suddenly then these metrics were changed to how well I met profit and loss numbers in my region. And that was something that I had no experience with. And of course I did then quite poorly with at the beginning. So regardless of the reason why, performing poorly, or rather knowing that we're performing poorly, is generally stressful. And thus changes that negatively impact how we perform at work, or how we perceive we perform at work, are also stressful. Now, changing job responsibilities might also mean that I'm no longer doing what I like at work. It could be that perhaps core tasks that I really enjoyed before have been changed, so that I'm doing things now that I find less interesting. Or maybe the introduction of, say, new technology to streamline processes has taken away some work that I actually really enjoyed doing. So you can think here of a project manager who, say, maybe before they really enjoyed the face-to-face interactions of project work, of teamwork, and they're suddenly becoming demotivated when a new technology is introduced in the workplace that takes team meetings and things to a virtual forum. Or maybe so many things have come my way that I'm suddenly feeling overloaded. You know, new tasks have been added to me all the time, and suddenly I don't have the time or resources to be able to deal with them. And of course, there's the issue of job insecurity. So when the nature of work is continually changing, job security is no longer a guarantee. In the US, where I come from, this is a real problem because employees can be fired at will. But I've heard also in Norway that even these permanent employees, these fast employees, can be let go if they are shown that they no longer meet the competence, they no longer have the competency required to carry out their job responsibilities. And if we couple this with the increasing pressure that employees face to keep themselves relevant, to manage their own employability in an organization, then we can quickly put together why job insecurity could be a real concern for employees. Because in changing work contexts, we don't really know what's expected of us. And if we're then also put in charge of managing our own employability, This creates a lot of uncertainty regarding what do we need to do to remain competent and to remain employable in the organization. Now, these workplace stressors, and there's certainly more than what I've mentioned here, they can lead to job strain, which can cause physical and emotional exhaustion, frustration, anxiety, depression, and even burnout, which in turn could lead to more serious physical and mental health issues, and could keep us from showing up at work or even lead us to perhaps leave our jobs. And in order to avoid this, at least some of us are going to look for help, right? However, as problematic as these chain of events might be, what's even more problematic is that for every employee that's looking for help, that's seeking help for how to deal with changes at work, there's more employees who don't know where to turn, who aren't coping well with change. And how could we really expect them to? Because really the time and the resources that they need to spend just dealing with the changes at work might not leave time for much else. So the difficulty of dealing with changes at work, it's more complex than just the obvious requirement to be adaptive. And as is often the case, a Dilbert cartoon tends to capture both this complexity and the irony from the employee perspective. So as Dilbert's colleague points out here, to become a change master in an ever-changing, change-adaptive environment, this requires not only responding effectively to changing work situations, it also requires accepting a broader range of work responsibilities for what ends up being less money and less job security than what we've had before. And also employees are expected to accept this with enthusiasm. You know, they're supposed to show support for these changes, to not show resistance for these changes. However, they're quite often expected to do this with none of the formal readiness preparations that we typically associate with change management. So there's many change management processes out there, but most emphasize stages that focus on employee readiness for change and include actions such as communicating change to employees, assessing employees' developmental needs, getting their feedback in the change management process, and involving them in change implementation. However, formal change management procedures, they aren't happening again for the majority of changes that employees face in the workplace today. And why is this? Well, one explanation is that it's a VUCA world out there. So maybe you've heard of this acronym or this expression, being a VUCA world. And you can't plan and prepare for change in a VUCA world. This term, in fact, is increasingly thrown out as an excuse to avoid the planning and strategy work that would be necessary for change management processes to be functional. But when organizations shrug off strategic planning, they also push this volatility, this uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity onto employees. And employees have to tackle it as it comes in the work environment with little preparation or support. So we might be able to better understand then why in the face of change, employees might look like this. We might have a feeling that they're resistant. But we could also then understand why this resistance might not be resistance at all, but rather it's just insecurity or uncertainty or how to act, or it may be amotivation or just exhaustion. So they just can't cope with it anymore. Now, VUCA, this is a term that came from the US Army War College. And it was a term that was used to describe conditions that the Army organization faced at the end of the Cold War. So it's a term that actually came out in the early 1990s. It's gained more prevalence today, but it's been established for a couple of decades. And what's interesting is a couple years after this term came out, VUCA, so did the term adaptive performance. And early research actually on adaptive performance was conducted in military organizations. So in 2000, Poulakos and colleagues, they had this article on adaptive performance, and yes, it was funded by the US Army. And the purpose of this research was to develop a taxonomy of adaptive performance, so to really understand what behaviors were involved when we talk about performing adaptively. And they did this by content analyzing over 1,000 jobs. They talked to employees and their supervisors across 21 different jobs and 11 different military, federal government, and state government organizations. And sorry, they took 1,000 different critical incidents of adaptive performance in these jobs. And they took these and organized it in a way, and they found that there was 8 different dimensions of adaptive performance. So this included things like handling emergency or crisis situations, demonstrating interpersonal and physical adaptability, solving problems creatively, and important, dealing with uncertain and unpredictable work situations, and learning new work tasks, technologies, and procedures. Over time, scholars have really focused on the 2 behavioral groups circled here. So the dealing with unpredictable work situations and the learning new work tasks, procedures, and technologies. And the reason they did this is they found that the other categories weren't always relevant for more general working situations. You know, of course, these were things that were developed in a military context, so we needed to find some things that really applied to all employees in a variety of different work contexts. And also they found that these were the most distinct dimensions from other components of performance, which would include just general task performance or proactive performance or, say, more contextual performance. And in particular, research by Mark Griffin and Sharon Parker has been instrumental to really promoting the definition of adaptive performance that we have today and the one that I use in my work, which they refer to also as adaptivity. So adaptive performance or adaptivity is defined as dealing with changing work situations and learning new skills when necessary. So again, really pulling these 2 components that Poulakos and colleagues found in their research together. So with this background, I want to shift our attention now to what adaptive performance entails and when learning is important for this behavior. Because again, the definition here says that learning is required when necessary, but let's start looking for these situations when learning is actually important. And to do this, I'm going to draw on this model from control theory here, which depicts the feedback loop. Now, if you remember, performance issues or knowledge that doing what I've always done before won't get the same results, this is a primary stressor related to changes at work. And a central tenet of control theory is that the desire to eliminate performance discrepancies, that is, to correct poor or potentially poor performance, this motivates our behavior. That is, we don't really like it when we perform poorly, and we realize, or when we realize that we're about to, and we really take action to be able to correct a course of action when we realize that we're going off course. So the feedback loop helps to identify these discrepancies. Now, the feedback loop, it can be viewed as an automatic process in which task performance is an input function, and feedback regarding task performance is continually monitored and compared to a referent performance goal. So in this process, feedback can come from the task itself. That is, we do something and we realize ourselves in that moment that what we're doing works or it doesn't work. Or perhaps we could get feedback from a supervisor, you know, someone in the work environment that's in a position to be able to monitor our performance and give us feedback. So if feedback about our task performance is in line with our referent performance goal, then the process continues as normal. That is, there's no reason to change course, right? We just keep performing as we always have. However, let's imagine that a change is introduced in the work environment. And this change has implications for our task performance, such that if we were to perform our task again as normal, it would no longer meet expectations, and a discrepancy would be identified. That is, we would realize ourselves, or we would be told by someone giving us feedback in the task environment, that what we're doing and how, if we're going to continue doing things the way we always have, it's no longer going to be sufficient for meeting our performance standards. As an example, we can imagine that this change involves the introduction, say, of a new procedure at work for carrying out a project. And say that if you don't follow these procedures, then your project won't get the necessary funding or priority that it needs to be able to go through and be implemented on time. Which would have implications, of course, for our own performance if we were rated based on our project deliverables. So So assuming that we're committed to meeting our performance goal, that is to perform well in our job, which is a general goal I think most of us have when going to work, identifying this discrepancy should result in corrective action. At least one option for correcting this performance discrepancy would be adaptive performance. And this adaptive performance will generally take one of two forms. So first, we could change the intensity of our existing task behavior, our existing task strategies. That is, we could work harder or work faster to be able to get things done in a different way. So in the case of the introduction of new project procedures, perhaps we start working faster so that we can get through our project timeline before these procedures are introduced so that we don't have to deal with them. That could be one way to adaptively perform. However, in this case, we're still carrying out the same task procedures, we're just doing so at different intensity. So another option, and one that's most likely, especially in the long term, is that we're going to change our strategy. That is, we're going to change the way we do our task work to accommodate this change. And when we decide to change strategies, again, there's two different ways that we might act. The first is it is possible that we might be able to use knowledge and skills that we've acquired from previous change episodes to be able to deal with the change that we have now. So maybe we've gone through a procedural change before in how we manage our project, and we remember from before certain things that we had to take into account, and therefore we can use some of this knowledge and skills that we've developed during this time to be able to facilitate our adaptive performance now. However, if we determine that the change needed is beyond our current knowledge and skills, then we have to learn new strategies. We have to learn a new way of working. We have to learn a new procedure to be able to carry out our project in order to be able to adapt. So that means that learning task strategies, it's a facet of adaptive performance. But it's really only something that we're going to expect when increasing the intensity of our behavior or applying previously acquired tasks and knowledge is deemed insufficient for creating a performance discrepancy that's created by a change. Now, why is this important to know? Well, first, because it helps us evaluate what kind of changes might require new learning, right? So when we go to introduce a change in the workplace, we can think ahead already. Are employees going to be able to manage this change just by working faster? Or will they be able to draw from experience that we've had in the past? Because that also helps the way we communicate this change. Or are they going to have to learn new ways of working, new ways of carrying out their work so that they can perform well in their jobs? And this is also important because learning takes time. You know, it takes energy, it takes resources, and we need to be able to plan for this, even if, say, in a VUCA world, we can't plan for everything. So just understanding when learning is going to be important helps from the project, from the change management process. Even if it's very small scale, it's how we communicate change and how we make time for change for our employees. However, more generally, being able to understand this process also helps us identify if learning could be more important for some employees than others when they adapt to change. And it's this question that actually I've worked with in my own research, looking at individual differences that could facilitate this learning adapting process. So in my research, I looked at openness to change, and this is a personal quality that could influence the extent to which employees engage in new learning and adapt to changes at work. Openness to change, it's a role orientation, and it's one in which employees are generally willing to accommodate changes at work. So they're generally unresistant to change. They see themselves as generally open to change and accepting of change in the workplace. Employees with a high openness to change, they're less likely to question or resist change, of course, and for that reason, they're also more likely to perform adaptively in change situations. However, they're also more likely to have experience with change. We're generally open about certain situations because we have experience with those situations. And as we have more experiences with situations, we become more open to them because we feel more control of those situations. So an employee that's very open to change, while they might be more likely to perform adaptively, they probably also are able to draw from a broader repertoire of skills and knowledge to be able to facilitate this adaptation. This means that employees who are highly open to change, they might not need to learn new skills, or at least not as often as employees who are less open to change. Or on the other hand, employees who are less open to change, they might need to learn these skills. They might need to take more time to learn new ways of working to be able to perform adaptively in the workplace. So I tested this hypothesis, which was that learning would be more important for the adaptive performance of employees with low openness to change than those with high openness to change. And I tested this in a sample appropriately of Norwegian defense employees. It was a relatively small group of employees, and they were all working in civil service occupations at the time. So they were working in financial management or employee development functions. So office workers, but about 60% had a military background. And I asked these employees 4 times over 4 months how much they adapted to change in general, and then also how much they had to engage in new learning to be able to adapt to this change. And I also asked them about their openness to change at the beginning of the study. Now, in analyzing the data collected, I found that there was a relationship between learning, having to engage in new learning and adapting to change. However, the positive relationship was significantly stronger for employees that had a low openness to change. So you see that in the yellow line here. The yellow line is steeper, and in the direction that it's going, that indicates that it's a more positive relationship between engaging in learning from month to month and adapting to change. So this supported my hypothesis, which again was that learning would be more important for these employees that had a low openness to change, were less open to change. And this was because they should have less experience with change and less skills and behavioral repertoires to draw from to be able to adapt to change. So I'll come back to this study in a couple minutes, but I want to go back first to control theory, the nice feedback loop here, to address another question that relates to adaptive performance and learning. And it's a question that concerns the mechanisms that influence employees' persistence and adapting to changes at work. So when they really have to go through this negative feedback loop many times or very frequently to be able to continually perform well at work, what does it take to be able to persist well in this environment? So could there be certain personal qualities that could help some employees cope with job demands, especially very frequent job changes, more effectively than others? And again, in my own research, I looked at learning goal orientation. So learning goal orientation, this is a personal quality that reflects a preference for challenge in developing new competence. And it's something that could help employees cope more effectively with these ongoing changing demands at work. So learning-oriented employees, they're more willing to take on new and challenging activities because they offer the opportunity for learning and growth, and that's their goal. They want to learn, they want to grow, and they look for opportunities that are going to offer that for them. Further, though, individuals having a high learning goal orientation, they're also known to show persistence and resilience when confronting obstacles or threats in their environment. So these qualities should make learning-oriented employees more naturally motivated to engage in changing work situations, because they're going to see these situations as a challenge, as an opportunity to develop their skills and competence. And they're also going to have a stronger resilience in terms of meeting the demands of the situation. So the hypothesis here was that employees having the adaptive performance of employees having a high learning goal orientation, it would be more effective than those having a low learning goal orientation, and particularly when the demands to perform adaptively were high. So my findings based on this data, again, supported the hypothesis that employees who have a high learning goal orientation adapt more effectively to change, and that those with a low learning goal orientation, that they struggle. And again, particularly, we see that this is when the demands for adaptive performance are high. So I asked these employees how I measured the adaptive demands was from the employee perspective. So how often they felt they were being asked to adapt. And I conducted the study in a sample of production employees who really change was an everyday thing for them. Every morning they had a meeting where they discussed what they had to do differently today to be able to meet their production goals. And sometimes that would even be kind of changed in the middle of the day again when they realized they were off course. So it was a very volatile environment in terms of knowing, from the beginning of the day what you were going to be doing to the end of the day, kind of the progression there. And so, yeah, you see that when demands for adaptive performance were low, so when they perceived that they really didn't have to change that frequently, then having a high learning goal orientation or a low learning goal orientation, it didn't really matter. These are pretty close, and they're they're pretty close, and they're both rated rather effectively by their supervisors. However, it was really when they saw that the demands that they faced in the workplace were really intense, that they had to change quite often, that then you saw a big gap in terms of how low learning goal-oriented employees performed versus their high learning goal-oriented counterparts. So interestingly here, learning itself wasn't important to adaptive performance. So it wasn't that employees that were highly learning-oriented learned more and therefore were able to apply this knowledge and skills to what they were doing to perform more effectively. Because it happened so quickly, there wasn't really a learning process in this work team. However, it was just that having this learning orientation, it seemed to help them cope more effectively with this change. And this was likely because they saw, again, they saw a learning opportunity in change. So they were able to maintain motivation to perform adaptively despite high demands for performing adaptively, because they saw that they could learn from this opportunity. So putting these studies together, a conclusion could be that when learning is needed to perform adaptively, even if it is it's more critical for employees who are less open to change, but that even when learning is not needed, having a high learning goal orientation benefits employees facing high demands for adaptivity. So again, what do we do with this information? Well, we could use it, of course, we could apply it, of course, into selection applications. So knowing that certain personal qualities facilitates adaptive performance, both the efficiency and the effectiveness in which they perform, it has obvious selection applications. We know that employees who are more open to change, they adapt more readily to change, and as my own study shows, they also do so more efficiently because they don't need to engage in new learning. And we also know then that learning goal orientation, that employees having a high learning goal orientation, they're going to adapt more effectively. My research shows this, but there's other research as well confirming this. And particularly then in contexts when demands for adaptive performance are high. So when selecting new employees, it's probably useful to be able to look for these qualities in new employees. However, by understanding the ways in which learning goal orientations and actual learning influence adaptive performance, we can also better identify factors in the work context that could help employees become more adaptive. That is, we can identify ways that we can develop adaptive performers within the organization. And to this end, my own research points towards immediate supervisors as playing a very important role, particularly when they display developmental or mastery-oriented leadership. So developmental leadership, it can be described as supervisory behavior aimed at recognizing an individual's developmental needs and goals, and providing them the support they need to be able to meet these goals. So that support could be performance feedback, coaching, learning opportunities, recognition. And it's a type of leadership that was identified by Rafferty and Griffin, but it's not a new type of leadership. So this isn't a new construct to throw at you. You've probably heard of it before, just called by different names. So first of all, Linda Lai, she was my PhD supervisor. She refers to developmental leadership as mastery-oriented leadership, or mestringsorientert ledelse in Norwegian. And in her book, she also outlines the specific behaviors of mastery-oriented or developmental leaders. So taking the time again to learn about each employee's desires for further development, giving employees the support and encouragement needed to meet these personal goals and ambitions, providing helpful performance feedback and the advice and support needed to improve, providing challenges at work that help develop and strengthen employee skills, and also making sure employees get credit when they do something good, so they get recognition for good performance. You've probably also heard of transformational leadership. And I think a lot of people, when they think about transformational leadership, they associate it with showing charisma, having a vision, and inspiring employees to perform in a way that supports that vision. And key parts of transformational leadership are about that. They're about communicating goals and visions and motivating employees towards behavior that supports those goals and visions. And we've referred to these components of transformational leadership as inspirational motivation. So this is about setting the vision of the future and really inspiring employees to move towards this vision. And then also idealized influence, which is acting more as a role model for the behaviors that are desired and necessary to achieve this vision. However, a part of transformational leadership is also about providing intellectual stimulation, such as encouraging employees to look for new ways of doing things, for better ways of doing things, and creative solutions. And then we also have individualized consideration. And this is about showing general concern for employees' well-being and also for their developmental needs. And developmental leadership is a part of individualized consideration. Now, it's not surprising that developmental leadership, as it's derived from transformational leadership, would be associated then with adaptive performance. Because transformational leadership is at its core about creating change. The word transformational itself refers to making a change in the form or nature of something. That's when we talk about inspirational motivation, which involves communicating a vision. This is quite often a vision for a changed future state. An idealized influence is therefore about acting as a change agent in the organization. So really role modeling those behaviors that are necessary to meet this changed future that the leader wants to achieve. Similarly, intellectual stimulation, this is about encouraging employees to generate creative ideas. So asking them to generate productive change in the organization. We refer to this more as proactive behavior. So it's creating change in the workplace to be able to achieve the vision of the organization. And finally, individualized consideration and developmental leadership more specifically is concerned with helping employees acquire new or improve existing knowledge and skills so that they're able to perform effectively in diverse or changing work situations. So in addition to helping employees be prepared to perform in changing work situations, developmental leadership is also important because it's found to enhance employees' confidence in their abilities to deal with a broader range of work situations. This increases feelings of control over changing situations. Other research suggests that developmental leadership helps produce more adaptive, emotional, and motivational states among employees that helps facilitate more productive coping when they're faced with high demands for change at work. So again, there's reason to believe that developmental leadership could be useful for influencing adaptive performance. So I looked also at this construct then in my own research. But one of the things that I found out, or that I really looked into, is who benefits the most from developmental leadership. Which employees in the organization are going to benefit from this type of support? So in my study of Norwegian defense employees, here I found that employees who, again, were less open to change, they also required more learning to be able to adapt to changes in the workplace. And I found here that developmental supervisor support, it facilitated this learning adaptive process. So it helped these employees learn and in turn adapt to change, where it did not facilitate the same process for employees that were highly open to change. So developmental leadership, it did help employees who were highly open to change. It kind of encouraged them to learn more from month to month, but they didn't apply this learning to perform adaptively anyway. So developmental leadership didn't have that kind of trickle over effect on adaptive performance for employees who were highly open to change. Similarly, in my study conducted with the production workers, I found that employees having a low learning goal orientation, again, they adapted less effectively to changing demands, particularly when those demands were high. And in this sample, developmental leadership was found to have an insignificant influence in helping those employees that had a high learning goal orientation perform more effectively. So there was a very small difference in terms of adaptive performance effectiveness if a high learning goal employee worked for a leader that had that gave them developmental support or not. However, if it was a low learning goal oriented employee and they received developmental support, they were greatly aided, so significantly aided. This meant that they were able to maintain a higher level of adaptive performance even when demands were high, whereas employees that did not receive this support, that had a low learning goal orientation and also did not receive developmental support, they really struggled then in this environment. So this is where you saw the drop in adaptive performance. So in this sample, developmental leadership, again, it was found to have an insignificant influence on adaptive performance of high learning goal-oriented employees because basically these employees did just fine on their own. but it did help those with a low learning goal orientation. So the main takeaway of these two studies is that some employees are going to experience greater challenges in changing work situations. And this could be that they need to learn more things than other employees, or that perhaps they just see it as a real, they're not motivated to persist when they see a lot of changes coming their way. And it's these employees that could benefit more from receiving developmental leadership. So that means to say that developmental leadership, it's not going to be as important for those employees that are running to embrace change. And it's probably less likely to be important for these employees that are always on the lookout for change. They're always looking for what's coming next. Because these employees already have the resources. They have the resources internally to be able to perform adaptively. Developmental leadership, however, is more important for those employees who are vulnerable in changing work situations. So it's going to be those employees that are showing resistance or seem to be struggling to keep up. Or maybe they're performing unreliably, or they're just unsure what to do. They're paralyzed by change. These are the employees who are going to need help finding direction and motivation to be able to adapt in changing work situations. So again, what is developmental leadership then, and how do we do it? Specific leader behaviors that we can highlight when talking about developmental leadership. So again, this includes taking the time to understand each individual employee's developmental needs and goals, providing these employees with helpful performance feedback regarding their work, so telling them how they're doing, and really focusing on performance improvement. So giving them helpful advice to be able to learn and improve. Suggesting relevant strategies or learning activities that could be helpful in accomplishing this development, and creating opportunities where they can develop and grow. So not just giving them, suggesting certain training that they could take, but also creating opportunities in the workplace where they could learn new skills. And finally, showing recognition for developmental achievements and performance improvements. So developmental leadership, it's a part of transformational leadership again, so it's focused on change. And the specific behaviors involved here are very much similar to coaching behaviors. So we could also think of developmental leadership as change-oriented coaching. So specifically, if we apply developmental leadership behaviors in a changing work environment, we could see supportive behaviors making an effort to understand the individual implications of change and enhancing employees' knowledge of these implications. So seeing how each individual could respond differently to the changing situation. It could also be about suggesting specific strategies for accomplishing work objectives in the changed environment, identifying the learning activities that could be helpful in enabling new ways of working, and providing challenging assignments together with training and together with ongoing performance feedback to be able to facilitate mastery and confidence behind these new task strategies. And then finally, again, recognizing successful improvement and adaptation. So in many ways, change-oriented coaching or developmental leadership, it's like carrying out an individually focused change management process, right? Because it's one when we're really looking from on an individual basis, what employees need to be ready for change. So ironically, even in a VUCA world, where change management is likely to be deemed unrealistic, change management still seems to be pretty important, at least at the individual level, and at least when we're talking about those employees that could be struggling with change. Now, will some leaders be more natural in offering developmental support? Does this kind of skill come more naturally to some types of people than others? And the obvious answer here is yes. In particular, having a learning goal orientation, a leader themselves having a learning goal orientation is going to help them be more developmentally oriented in their leader role. Because this preference for self-development and learning, this is going to also trickle over into how they deal with their employees. And in my own research, I also find that leaders that have a high learning goal orientation, they also have employees that perceive that adaptability is more important and expected of them in the workplace, and that these employees then go on to perform more adaptively and to learn, new skills when needed, more readily than when a leader has a low learning goal orientation. And we predict that happens not only because these leaders give employees developmental support, but because they also role model this adaptive behavioral response pattern when changes and challenges in the workplace come up. Now, what could be done then to support developmental leadership? An obvious support measure taken from that last slide is that we need to help leaders identify what their own goal orientation is, and if they do not have a strong learning goal orientation, then perhaps help them develop one, which again could be done by giving those leaders coaching or developmental support. However, in addition to this, we could also look at promoting and role modeling developmental leadership at the highest levels of the organization. So again, really counting on that trickle-down effect when we have a strong role model at the top of the organization and how that influences the behaviors of leaders at lower levels of the organization. A second point would be to formalize HRM practices that could help support employee development. So those could be things like developmental performance appraisal, so a place where developmental feedback could be given, training and development programs, job enrichment programs, basically programs that support employee development, because these, in addition to supporting a leader to be able to provide developmental support, they also signaled that development is important. And therefore also hopefully build an expectation that leaders should be developmental when dealing with employees. And then a last point that I would ask you to consider would be to rethink talent management programs that intentionally prioritize identifying and investing in top talent. We invest in these top talent because we predict that they're going to, generate future value for the organization. But if we instead focus on a talent management program or talent development program that was more inclusive, that invested in all employees, we might be able to get stronger contributions from each employee every day, as opposed to waiting for it to come in the future. So in closing, if you're interested in developing adaptive performers, and I've been led to believe that many organizations are, what do you need in your toolbox? So the first, obviously, would be developmental leaders. And that should be both a strong role model at the top of the organization and developmental leaders throughout the organization that are in supervisory roles so that they can support their employees. Second, though, and equally important in my opinion, is having a real empathy for the complexity and challenge and sometimes contradictory situations that employees face when dealing with change. Because when we have a greater empathy and understanding of what they're going through, we're probably less likely to label slow adapters as being resistant. And we're more likely then to look for the more accurate reasons for why they could be slow to adapt to change. And if we understand the more accurate reasons, then we're also more able and more likely to be able to help them. And then finally, I think it's important to have a felt responsibility for enabling employees to perform well and to remain employable in changing work situations. This mantra that employees need to make themselves relevant in changing work situations, that they need to manage their own employability, it's a cop-out. That is, it's shirking a responsibility that I think organizations and leaders have to minimize the obsolescence of employees and to reduce the numbers of employees that are displaced or disadvantaged by changes. And until we truly take responsibility for this, these changes, how we deal with employees that are slow to adapt to change, it's not going to happen. So I want to leave on that point then, or on the last point. This is an article that I recently read on Harvard Business Review. And it presents, I think, a new perspective in terms of adaptive performance and the competitive advantage of being adaptable. And the message that it sends to me is that perhaps when we talk about adaptability as being something that's key for competitive advantage, this should not come with the expectation that employees are first-line responders in a VUCA environment, but rather come with the expectation that organizations, they're going to continually develop their employees so that the organization, through its organizational members, will actually drive adaptive change in the workplace and not just respond to it. Yeah, thank you.